My name is Nathan Judd. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland and a Peter Buck Fellow here at the Smithsonian in the Department of Paleobiology. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the early evolution of flowering plants. So for most of the history of life on Earth, in terms of vegetated life on Earth, the world has been dominated by ferns and seed plants, like some of the ones you just saw with Bill. But about 130 million years ago, sort of the last quarter, a new kind of plant emerged, plants with flowers. And today, they are the most diverse, the most abundant, and by far the most widespread across different habitat types. And this marks one of the most important evolutionary transitions in life on land. So here's a simple family tree of the major groups of flowering plants. You might recognize monocots at the top, which includes things like palms and orchids, and some of our most important crops like corn, wheat, and rice. You might recognize water lilies at the bottom, and the group that I've got in bold there, the eudicots, is the most diverse group and includes most of the broadleaf trees you're familiar with. Now, my research here at the museum has and elsewhere has shown me that the evolution of these major groups happened during an interval of time that's even more rapid than has generally been appreciated. So all of those major groups appeared within about 5 to 8 million years at the most, and that's about as good a resolution as we can get in the fossil record, so it may have even been more rapid. So this interval of time was in the early Cretaceous, around 130 million years ago, and where I work in the Cloverleaf Formation out in Wyoming, which I'll show you in a moment, is a body of rocks that were deposited during this interval of time, from about 140 to about 110 million years ago. And I'm interested in how that incredible radiation played out on the ancient landscape. We can use modern DNA to figure out how plants are related to each other, but to understand what that meant on the landscape in the Cretaceous, we have to go out to the fossil record. And so this is a picture of where I work out in Wyoming. This little dot is me walking up a hillside there. And what I'm using this to illustrate is that we can recognize different kinds of environments in the fossil record, or in the rock record. For example, this large body, the cliff I'm walking over, is a sandstone channel fill. So this represents an ancient river. And the bands of color above it on the hillside above me represent ancient floodplain deposits. So I just want to illustrate here that we can detect different kinds of environments. And then in those different environments, we find different plant fossils. So we can start to put together what the landscape looked like through time. We might be able to, and we can recognize coarsely different habitat types, like near channel environments where the plants would have experienced flooding, pond environments where there were light gaps available, but there was less disturbance from flooding, and then the floodplain deposits away from the channel where there was less flooding, but probably canopy cover. So what this shows is that there's variation in light availability, water availability, and disturbance regime. And those are some of the three most important things for plants. So here's some pictures I'm going to show you from the different habitat types. This is from the distal floodplain, the back swamp, where we see very early in flowering plant evolution, the landscape is still dominated by ferns and conifers. I've got some redwoods at the top, some foliage and cones, a large fern frond, and two different flowering plants on the lower right that come from this environment. This is from the pond environments. I've mixed and matched some fossils here from different ponds. We have multiple different sites that represent the same kind of environment. And again, what we see is redwood foliage dominates, and ferns make up most of the diversity and most of the fossils outside of the redwoods. But we do find some floating aquatic angiosperms. We find water lilies and some other ancient lineages of flowering plants that we can tell are flowering plants, but we can't yet figure out what their modern relatives are. In fact, they may be extinct. And then this is an example of some of the kinds of fossils we find along the river channels. And almost all of these are flowering plants. I've got one conifer in the lower middle portion there. But these are different kinds of flowering plants, include relatives of modern sycamore and other kinds of trees that you might be familiar with. So what I found so far is that what I hope this does is it paints a picture that about 110 million years ago in Wyoming, there was an ancient basin landscape that was dominated by redwood forest and ferns and many of these ancient lineages. But flowering plants were made up of a high diversity of species very early on. They were widespread in different kinds of environments, but they were generally rare. They weren't the abundant, dominant things, except in some of the disturbed areas along the river channels. So finally, I think the take-home point here is that the flowering plants, when they evolved, they spread out across the landscape and sort of infiltrated these existing ancient ecosystems long before they took them over. And with that, I'd like to thank with the University of Maryland Graduate School and the Smithsonian here for funding, and several of my field assistants that have worked with me out in Wyoming. Thank you.
What area is covered by your field study site?
Yeah. So the question is, what area is covered by my field study site? And I have sites, I have collections of plant fossils out of the ground from across north central Wyoming, a little east of Yellowstone. So these come across tens of kilometers. I have different samples.